And I'm going to introduce the topic. We have Q&A on the vaccine with Nurse Maria from Dawson. And my name is Maria-25Feb21. I'm with Yukon, and we are so pleased that Nurse Maria could join us and share some answers to common questions that we're seeing. So we've received quite a few questions, and Maria has kindly grouped those questions, and we'll be answering those. And I'm going to hand it over to Wayne to do a little bit of an intro and acknowledgement.
Thanks, Thea, and thank you for your assistance with putting this together. My name is Wayne Poderoka, coming to you along with Maria Nyland from the traditional territory of the Chronovirus. If you are tuning in, I want you to know that we care enough about you to get you some of the answers you're probably asking about this Moderna vaccine. We know that there is a lot of information out there, some of it pretty spooky, about what this vaccine is about. And we want to help you make an informed decision about whether or not to get that shot. And we thought the best person to help with that is Maria Nyland, who is our public health nurse here in Dawson, probably one of the nicest people you're ever going to meet. We do have a number of questions that she has, well, we've compiled over the last couple of days, and thank you very much for sending them in. If you do have questions that you would like to ask today, you can do that by going to slido.com, that's SLIDO.com, putting in the number 84109 and typing in your question. You can also fire us a Facebook message at the Mayor Wayne Poderoka Facebook page or the Chronovirus Facebook page. Without further ado, I am going to take my video off and send you over to Maria.
Thank you, Wayne, and thank you, Mathia. And I also want to say thank you to the Hän People. I'm so happy that I've been able to work here for the last 20-some years on the traditional territory of the Hän. And I have a great love for them and for all of our community. So I'm thankful that I can be here today, and I'm going to do my best to answer questions. I'm going to start, just jump right in with a bit of an introduction. I've been doing info sessions around town, and this is some stuff that I've shared here locally, and I'm hoping that it will be helpful for people around the territory as well. So I'm going to start with that, and then we'll look at some questions that we've had. So Mathia has a picture that she's going to show everyone. If you're on video, you might be able to see that. And it will help explain a little bit about what an mRNA vaccine is. In the Yukon territory, we're using the Moderna vaccine. Moderna is a company name, and they have been able to manufacture an mRNA vaccine. mRNA stands for messenger, M, RNA, this is a big word, ribonucleic acid, and that is a genetic part of the coronavirus DNA stuff. So we have mRNA in our bodies, and viruses have mRNA, animals have mRNA within their DNA. mRNA is basically a recipe or instructions on how to make something. So when Moderna and Pfizer were studying how to make mRNA vaccine, they had to have the genetic sequence for the coronavirus. So I don't know if anybody remembers, but way back at the beginning of 2020, there was news articles saying that Chinese scientists had been able to map out the genetic sequence, and they were sharing that with the world. And that was very valuable information early on, and right away, there were manufacturers, Pfizer and Moderna, that were looking at that genetic sequence and thinking about how that could be used in an mRNA type vaccine. So there are questions about like why was it able to be manufactured so quickly? And one of the reasons that that was able to be done is because mRNA technology has actually been studied for quite a few years. Back in the 1990s, about 20 years ago, they were looking at mRNA as we were learning more about genetic sequencing and DNA, about how that could be used in different ways in health. And one of the really exciting ideas is that it might be able to be used in cancer treatment. mRNA could be used to send specific messages to our bodies to know how to fight off specific cancer cells. And that's a very unique way of looking at cancer treatment that could be really life-changing for people. So they've been studying this over time. And then more recently, in the last 10 years, they've been looking at using that type of technology for different types of vaccinations. Ebola in Africa has been a really significant challenge. Zika, even more recently in our part of the hemisphere, and HIV is another one. There's quite a few other types of infectious diseases that they've been looking at using this type of vaccine for. So using mRNA for the coronavirus pandemic was not a new idea. It's something that's been studied. And there's papers that you can find online concerning this technology that have been published in the last few years about that and the way that it was going to be made. So one of the ways that I have told people here in Dawson about why it was made so fast is it's kind of like having cookie dough in the freezer, kind of a plain cookie dough. And this mRNA platform is like the cookie dough, and it's been studied and actually trialed in people and in animals several times before coronavirus, this COVID-19 pandemic ever came around. So then they were able to pull this cookie dough out of their freezer and say, hey, let's put some chocolate chips or COVID-19 information into our cookie dough, and we can have it ready to go quickly. So that is kind of an illustration of why it was able to be manufactured so fast. So if we look at this picture, we can see the coronavirus there on the top, and you can see the purple spike sticking out. That's called the spike protein, and you've probably heard that mentioned in news articles. That was the way that scientists studying the coronavirus thought we could probably be able to recognize this coronavirus best, by the spike protein sticking out of it. So when I think about living in Dawson and people walking around in the wintertime with their gear on and you can't see their faces, how would you recognize them? Well, I know a friend who has had bright pink snow pants, so I recognize her by those bright pink snow pants. So our bodies need a way to recognize enemies. Now, this friend, of course, is not my enemy, but we need to know the enemy, the coronavirus, and we need to be able to recognize it so we can fight it off with our immune system. So mRNA is going to take a message to our cells and tell us about that spike protein and help us to learn about it. So the next little bit, you see this wiggly line, that represents the mRNA, the genetic sequence. It's actually not part of the actual virus, it's just the genetic information. So that's actually been synthesized, it's proteins put together in a lab. So it wasn't even part of the virus chopped up in this case, it's just a genetic sequence. And then the next picture, a purple circle with little purple dots around it, that represents the mRNA now inside a coating of fat. That's the lipid nanoparticles that you hear talked about, fancy word. And that is how it's going to slip into our body and be able to connect to our cells. So they put this mRNA sequence inside the lipid nanoparticles, and then they put it into that vial you see of vaccine, and then we're going to use part of that vial in Moderna's vaccine. There's 10 doses in each vial. We'll inject those mRNA sequences covered in lipids into our body, and then you see down near the bottom of this picture, the mRNA attaching to one of our cells and sending just the mRNA into our cell. Now, it does not go into our DNA. It can't change our DNA. It's only the recipe for how to make a specific part of the coronavirus. This mRNA is going to teach our cells how to make just the spike protein. Now, I hadn't actually realized this before I started doing a lot of reading about mRNA vaccine, but viruses actually, when they infect us, a cold, influenza, coronavirus, they actually go inside our cells and hijack our cells and use our cells against us. And we make coronavirus replication. We double, triple, thousands, millions of these viruses that will make us sick. So this mRNA is doing the same thing that the virus would do, but only in a little tiny bit. It's only going to make the spike protein. It's not going to make the whole virus. So it actually can't give us COVID-19 because it cannot make the whole virus. Our Moderna mRNA vaccine can only tell us how to make a spike protein, which is the outside part of the coronavirus. So then you see the spike protein sticking out of the cell, and in the bottom picture, you see what happens then in our body. The pink Y-shaped antibodies in this picture they're shown are the way that our body is learning to fight off the coronavirus. So the spike proteins are shown to our body. Our body says, this isn't me, I need to fight this off. And our immune system starts to react and make antibodies. So that's what happens when this mRNA vaccine goes into our body. Wayne, does that make sense to you?
It totally made sense when you started talking about cookie dough.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
So if we can recognize this COVID-19 virus by knowing what it looks like on its outside, then we're going to be able to fight it off when the real thing comes along later. So Mathia, you can take the picture off now. Sure. So yeah, do you have a question for me?
Yes, and I have a number of questions that have come in from folks, and much appreciated. People who have sent them in. I believe you answered this first one, but just to be sure, this vaccine, will it alter people's DNA?
No, it cannot alter our DNA. It actually does not go into the middle part of our cells where our DNA is stored, and mRNA does not tell our DNA to change in any way. This messenger RNA is only taking the message to our cells about how to make the spike protein.
Thank you. Before I ask the next one, you've been the Dawson public health nurse for how many years?
Well, I started working here in Dawson in November of 1997, and then in 2001 is when I took the community health nurse job.
Before I ask this next question, how many vaccines do you think you've administered in your career?
I have no idea.
If you had a spitball?
Oh dear.
Tens of thousands?
Maybe not tens of thousands, no.
Thousands?
Probably, possibly thousands.
All right.
Yeah.
We have a question here about the speed with which this vaccine was developed. You answered a lot of the questions around how mRNA technology has been utilized in the past and has been brought to bear against the COVID-19 virus. But people understand that it needs years of safety testing. How did this vaccine get approved so quickly?
That's a good question, and that's one I really want to cover. So one of the reasons it was able to be made so quickly was partly because of our cookie dough analogy, that the dough was already ready to go. The safety of that particular use of a vaccine type thing had been tested already in smaller portions in different types of infectious disease, not coronavirus. So when the genetic sequence was available, when the chocolate chips were made, they were ready to be put into the dough. They were ready to be put into this vaccine. So they had actually, it's interesting, Moderna had actually started to make a whole ton of cookie dough, a whole ton of the platform, the liquid type of stuff, all the materials, the ingredients before the genetic sequence was completely finished so that they would be ready to go. So that was one reason. Another reason is that there was so much money put into this. We know that Canada bought vaccines way back, I don't remember exactly what month it was, but about a year ago already, money was being invested, millions of dollars from many different countries. And this money was going to the vaccine manufacturers so that they would have plenty of dollars to buy the ingredients and to spend time working on the vaccine manufacturing and setting up all the clinical studies. So if you think about, I don't know if any of you know what scientific research is like, but it's a long slog for most scientists. They have to work a lot on getting grant money and finding space to work. They have to work at getting staff. They're often, when they're studying some minute question about science, it's a lot of work to even get a study going. And sometimes they're studying really rare things. And so it takes a lot of time to find study participants too. So in this case, when we had COVID-19 around the world and lots of people being exposed to it and lots of people very concerned about it, it was very easy to find study participants to volunteer And it was easy to find places where COVID-19 was circulating so that they could study the effects of the vaccine. So many things were really falling into place, like almost perfection possibly, so that the road was clear. There were no roadblocks in the way, where normally in the scientific process, it just has so many different challenges that scientists have to face along the way. And those were really removed by governments as they supplied money to the manufacturers so that they could find the people and do what they needed to do and study the studies. So back way in the summertime, they started out with a very small group of people, and they tried the vaccine, and there wasn't any concern about safety at that time. Then they tried a little bit bigger group, about 100 people, and again, they didn't see any real concerns about reactions and the safety of the vaccine. So then they did their big study, and I'm talking now specifically about Moderna because it's the information I know the best. And they had about 40,000 participants, and about half of those people got the actual vaccine and about half of them did not, so that they could tell if it was effective in the people that they got it. So they had to wait until people had gotten coronavirus infection before they could say that they had enough data. So that happened in the fall. Just before the US elections in October, they were able to say, okay, we've reached the point where we had set the bar at this point, and governments had actually been telling Moderna as well where they wanted that bar set. They had started these conversations in the summertime with Health Canada, here in Canada, with the FDA in the United States, and with the World Health Organization around the world, and with other international immunization groups as well. So in addition to those conversations and setting bars and safety measures and things like that, Health Canada, among all the other countries, said, this is what we want to see, and we want you to send your data right away. You don't have to wait until after everything is done and you've typed everything up and put it in a neat package. We want to see stuff kind of hot off the press. So that also sped things up, Wayne, is they got the information much, much faster than they normally do, so that they could start considering it carefully and taking the time, so that they didn't have to feel rushed in making that decision.
I have 1.5 more questions about production, and then I'm going to get to, I think, some of the really meaty questions that people have about the vaccination. But one last one, what's the difference between approval for a vaccine in regular times and approval for a vaccine under an emergency measures situation? And what stage are we at right now with this vaccine approval?
So in December, Health Canada made a decision about Moderna vaccine and about Pfizer, and it's called Emergency Authorization Use. I might not get all the terminology exactly right, so my apologies if I get little specific details wrong, but they were able to say, go ahead and use it, but we're going to be watching this very closely. And there are documents on Health Canada's website specifically naming exactly what they're going to continue to be checking for as we see this vaccine being used. This is not part of the trials, any clinical trials anymore. We are past that. We're not considered to be guinea pigs as we're getting the vaccine. We're not in a certain phase. Now, Moderna is continuing to study it for sure. They're continuing to do new clinical trials. One they're starting and they're recruiting right now for is ages 12 to 17. So they're getting participants right now for that. So we'll find that out in the future. But this vaccine will continue to be checked very carefully as it's used in Canada and across the globe. The interim order requires that Moderna tell them anytime they build a new manufacturing plant, for instance, because they want to make sure that they're checking the safety of those places. So we're not talking just about what happens in our bodies, but actually that we aren't going to have anything that's contaminated, that's extremely clean, that all the specific, very careful laboratory things are being followed. We don't want to just take something that somebody just is like, yeah, we'll just throw things in here and package it up and send it off. No, that's it. They're very careful about checking every single step and making sure that everything is very, very carefully done. One person was asking, Wayne, if you can access the published animal trials that were used to approve the Moderna vaccine. Now, animal trials would have happened probably in the early 2010s, like in the teens, like maybe 2015, 16, 17. because this platform had actually passed that stage by the time we got to coronavirus pandemic. So it had already been rigorously studied in animals like rats and mice, I think it was, that they had used. So they had studied this already. So when they started off with the coronavirus vaccine, they were able to introduce it, as they had already in the past with different infectious diseases, into humans in small portions and then larger.
Okay, thank you. Going to go into some of the questions that we've been receiving from folks, and feel free to use slido.com, slido.com. Enter the number 84109 if you've got another question you'd like to ask. We got a question here from someone who says that I've heard COVID-19 is like a bad flu for most people and 98% of the people recover. If that's true, why should I take a risk with this vaccine and have my body fight the virus off on its own? Isn't it better to let our body's natural immunity fight virus rather than drugs? Use drugs.
So that's a good question. And that's something that we always think about in health, is the risk versus the benefit of something. And so with COVID-19, about one in Canada, about 1 in every 13 people that get it actually have to go into hospital. So that's actually pretty high. And about 3 out of every 100 will die. So when I think about that rate, I always go back to how many people live in Dawson and what would that mean for the town of Dawson? So there's a debate about how many people live here, Wayne, but let's just go with 2,200. So if 2,200 people live here, 10% would be 220. 1% would be 22. So if I'm doing my math right, I think that would mean that if every single person in Dawson got COVID, 66 of us could be dying from COVID. That's massive. And I don't want that to happen in Dawson. And I certainly don't want to have that to happen in the Yukon. So how can we protect ourselves? So that all the measures we're doing help that for sure. And vaccine is something that is even more reliable because, you know, none of us like wearing masks and none of us like not getting together and having concerts and all those things. So, you know, long term, we need a different plan. Guidelines are good for now, but we certainly don't want to have them for, you know, the rest of our lives. So how can we develop immunity to it? And, you know, having the natural infection is one way that we might be able to develop immunity, but we're actually not sure how long immunity with natural infection lasts. We certainly hope that it lasts, but we don't know that for sure. We do know that with the vaccine, we've been able to have, in the study, it showed 94% protection after 2 doses. And that was to severe illness with COVID. So if I could say I have a 94% chance of not ever getting sick with COVID-19, if our vaccine lasts for a long time, I'm going to take that. It's way better than my chances of, you know, 97% death and 1 in 13. I'm not really fast on math, but that's a much higher percentage of getting hospitalized. The other thing to think about is when we get a natural infection with COVID, there are quite a few people that have long-term symptoms. So the people that get really sick, the people that go into hospital with COVID, a good number of them, and I don't have a percentage off the top of my head, but a good number of them have long-term symptoms from COVID. And so if a vaccine can provide us protection for that as well, that's pretty significant too.
I have to ask this because this is a question that I actually have about those long-term effects. Mm-hmm. What are some of those long-term effects that are presenting and I guess what people are come to know as the long haulers?
You know, that's a big question, Wayne, and I'm not sure I'm really qualified to answer it. Some of the things I've heard, though, seem to be related to clotting mechanisms in our body, and they're concerned about organ damage, but I'm not sure right now I can answer that really well. But that's something that if you have a question about, I can maybe look that up later or help you find the answer. But they are significant. I know I've heard stories, but of course it's important not to go by just one story or two, but stories of people who were very healthy and now months later still are not able to go back to work. So that's not everyone for sure, but it is a concern.
Thank you. I think you've answered that question. So I'll move on down to some of the questions we've been getting about efficacy. Even with 2 doses, are you still likely to get the virus?
That's a good question, and we don't know a lot about this long-term effectiveness yet. So Moderna was using their vaccine, I think they started in the summer. By October, late October, they had given everybody in their study that was going to get the vaccine 2 doses. So now this would be, what, November, December, we're 4 months after that. So they're going to continue to collect data about how effective this vaccine is, and they're going to actually spend 2 years on this. So we're going to continue to hear through Health Canada what Moderna is saying about how effective and how long this immunity is going to last. Now, backing up how effective it is, I just want to cover that. So with 1 dose, they were seeing antibodies in people's blood at about 80% rate after the first dose. They had tested their blood, I think, 2 weeks after the vaccine. We know that vaccines often reach their full effectiveness in about 2 weeks after they're given. That's true with most immunizations. So then they gave a second dose, because it's true with most immunizations that you need a booster shot to remind our body how to fight off long term. So in order for us to remember our multiplication tables, we don't just study them one day. We study them, and then we study them again, and then we study them the next year in school. So in the same way, our immune system gets exposed to what this spike protein looks like for mRNA stuff. We get exposed to the spike protein. We learn how to fight off that spike protein coded coronavirus, but our bodies might not remember it for a long time. So we want to give a booster dose to make sure we get a longer immunity, so we don't have to keep going back again and again to get this immunization. I hope, but we don't know how long it'll last. We hope it'll last longer. So we'll continue to look at that. Now, are we going to get the virus? The question about are we going to get a virus after we get the vaccine really depends on how much virus is going to be circulating in our community. So that is one of the reasons we need to continue the guidelines that we're doing now: masking, staying distant, washing our hands really well, not going to work if you're sick, or not going to school or out to the grocery store if we're sick, until we can see that cases, at least in Canada, are really settling down, and that we're not going to have risk of travelers coming into Yukon bringing COVID, and that we can start maybe spending more time together as groups. So that's going to be watched really carefully. So it's not just about, right now, it's not just about getting our vaccinations done, but it's also about seeing what happens with case counts and the spread in communities and in our country and in our world as well.
Got a few more questions. Oh, I got lots of questions. Does getting the vaccine mean I can no longer pass COVID on to other people?
We don't know that either yet, and I wish I had better answers, but we're going to get them for sure. That is something everyone is intensely curious about, and I know that there were some recent news articles out of Israel. Israel's been so speedy at getting vaccines to their population that they are becoming kind of a study as a country. What's happening there now? Are they going to see less transmission? And it's really early, and it's really too early to say for sure. But it looks like it's positive, because hospitalization rates are going down in Israel. So it sounds like it might be good news. So let's just keep our ear to the ground and find out. And you know what? In Yukon, maybe we'll find out if we can get enough people vaccinated here, and maybe we'll see a lot less transmission too.
That would be great. I want to talk a little bit about side effects, because of course a number of us have already gotten the first dose, and now we're hearing all sorts of scary stories about what happens when you get the second. There have been reports that even some people have died or got very sick after the vaccine. I don't know if you're able to address that, but can you maybe give us an idea about how we might feel after getting our second shot?
Sure. So I know that there were some reports about death. I think there was a long-term care facility somewhere, maybe in Europe, where some people had died. And there has not been any link to those deaths and their vaccination itself. I know there was also questions sometimes about people who had gotten the immunization and just days later got COVID. So, and that's unfortunate. I see that also sometimes happening in the past with influenza vaccines, where we may have had flu virus circulating in Dawson and somebody got their flu shot, but then just days later got sick with actual influenza. So the reason that is because we need about 2 weeks to really mount a really good immunity and be ready. So, you know, when somebody goes into basic training, the first day they're not necessarily ready to be a soldier, but on day 14, they might be a lot more ready, and our bodies are the same way. We need a little time to be actually ready to fight it off. So they do look very carefully at what happens after an immunization. I am part of that reporting process here in Canada. And so I'm sure that in Europe, where there have been concerning things happen, maybe in this long-term care facility, they looked very carefully about what a cause of death might have been. And we will continue to look very carefully at that. But this vaccine has been given to millions of people now, and there have not been actually any real big concerns about serious reactions to it. And it's very encouraging to us because we want to watch that very carefully. So with the first dose, we did see some local reactions in arms here in Dawson. Sometimes people were getting a bit of a redness and an itchy spot, even up to a week or two after the immunization. Some people had a few swollen lymph nodes, maybe on the side where they got their immunization. But not many people were getting fevers. And so I've got in front of me the Moderna, what we call a monograph. It's the information that's really digs down deep and it has details. And this is available online if anybody's interested. But it really is helpful to me to look at the rates. And so I have it in front of me so I can read it. So people that are 18 to 64 with the first dose of Moderna vaccine, about 1% got a fever after the first dose. And after the second dose, about 17% got a fever. So it is known that as we encourage our body to have a stronger immune response, that it is natural for us to also experience more side effects and to feel more sick. And really, it's a signal that our immune system is doing what it's supposed to do and doing its job. Also, people might feel body aches afterwards, and that is a normal side effect to a vaccine. It's a normal reaction that our immune system does when we're fighting anything off, that we feel like we're coming down with something, and we might run a fever and feel achy all over. And so it's expected that as our immune system does its job, that we might feel that way. Now, not everyone feels that way. It doesn't mean that their immune system isn't working. Moderna had 17% of people get a fever, but 94% of those people were protected against serious COVID infections. So even the people that didn't get fever were still getting some real good effectiveness from that vaccine. So I would anticipate in our communities in the Yukon that we are definitely going to see more fevers and body aches after that second dose, because we already are kind of ready to fight. We're already kind of primed for this. And so with our second dose, our body is going to have a stronger side effect to the immunization. That's a normal expected thing. If you have questions though about your side effects, it's important that you follow up with someone, especially if these are things that you did not expect that might happen. So one question, it's kind of, it's interesting is, COVID-19 has a fever as a red symptom we call it in the Yukon. And a fever is also something that we might experience after the second dose. So it's important for us to make sure that we follow what Dr. Hanley has told us about testing after when we have a fever. And I believe the message has been that, if you have a fever for about 24 hours, stay in bed, stay home, see how things are going. And if it continues after 24 hours, then call a healthcare provider and talk about whether you need to get tested for COVID. We want to make sure that we're not missing actual COVID infection kind of covered up by a side effect from the vaccine. So we want to be very careful, especially in our rural communities, that where we have less resources, that we don't miss something happening that might be COVID as opposed to the vaccine side effects. So that's important. Generally speaking, though, people have been tolerating that second dose okay. I was part of a group of healthcare professionals that got our second dose a couple weeks ago, and some of us did get fevers and body aches, but we have all recovered and we're back at work, and things are going well.
what if someone decides not to get that second dose? Would they be more prone to getting the virus?
Well, we know that Moderna said that after that first dose, they saw about 80% effectiveness. We don't know how long that lasts with that first dose. I would be concerned if someone chose not to get their second dose, that they may have less chance of having long-term immunity to the COVID-19 virus. So please, I would recommend strongly that you get that second dose. If you have concerns about what happened with your first dose, though, and you need to talk about that with a healthcare provider, please do that. But we know that generally in an immunization world, a booster dose helps us remember that immunologic stuff longer. So getting that second dose is really going to cement our memory to the virus.
Okay.
You know, I wanted to cover something, Wayne, that I kind of missed earlier. Someone was asking, does getting the vaccine mean I can no longer pass coronavirus onto other people? We don't know that. I kind of talked about that a little bit, kind of broadly with transmission, but I would say in our personal lives, even if you've gotten 2 doses of coronavirus vaccine, please still treat the guidelines as important right now. We don't know how many times we might be able to actually have an asymptomatic COVID infection and still be able to pass it on. We hope that it is not going to be the case, but we don't know that for sure yet. And so until we know that information, we need to be really careful still and protect those around us.
I got more questions for you, Maria.
Okay.
You can switch bagels later too. Are they using people in the north to test the safety of the Moderna vaccine? Because it sure seems weird that we're getting it first and not people in the crowded cities.
So no, they're not using people in the north to test it. We already have confidence in the Moderna vaccine to be used anywhere. And so the reason that we're really wanting to see the northern population, the rural and remote and indigenous populations immunized thoroughly and early is because we know that we have more risks living so far away from big cities. If someone here in Dawson had to be hospitalized for COVID, at the very least, they would have to go to Whitehorse, and they possibly would have to go on to Vancouver. That's very disruptive for families. It's very scary, and we take a big risk when we have a community far away from what we call tertiary or like Vancouver style healthcare. So we want to make sure that we remotely are protected early, so that we don't have those outbreaks that unfortunately some other provinces have seen in remote areas.
All right. Here's a question. Someone wants to know, if I get the vaccine and I already have underlying health issues, will I get sick? Why do so many people get sick for a week or so?
So it depends on what your underlying health issue is. So that's kind of a broad question. I have not heard of people getting sick for a whole week, but it would be interesting to talk to those folks and hear what they had experienced. Generally, we would say if you have a real serious chronic condition, that you're more at risk for getting severe COVID infection. And so we would really like to see you protected from COVID-19 and get immunized. Now, there are some questions around autoimmune conditions and immunosuppressive conditions, people that are on medications, and those are best discussed with your health care provider. Certainly, we have some guidance that really helps us figure out risks and benefits, and that's true with many situations. We have to determine what your risk for COVID-19 infection is and how sick you might get from it versus the risk of maybe the vaccine itself, the side effects that you might experience, and then the benefit that the vaccine will give you. You know, somebody was saying that they hate needles and they hate going to the doctor. And so this person was asking, does this vaccine use a big needle and will it hurt? And how long will the needle be in my arm? So I give lots of immunizations, and I know people get pretty nervous sometimes about it. And so I try to be as gentle as I can. It's interesting with this COVID-19 vaccine. I was helping in Dawson about a month ago, giving a lot of these injections to people, and people said, oh, that didn't really hurt at all. And so this immunization actually has very little to put into it. This is what really had to be there. So there's no special preservative or something we call adjuvant that sometimes made it sting for other immunizations. So this immunization really seems to be not stingy, not painful when it goes in. I actually use exactly the same size needle for an adult. Like the diameter is 25 gauge. It's exactly the same as I use for a 2-month-old baby. And so it's a very tiny needle. So you don't need to be scared of it. Also, I would say if someone is anxious or they have sometimes experienced fainting when they get an immunization, there is an opportunity for you to lay down at a clinic, and we would make sure that you would be, safe and secure and as easily this whole process done as possible. So we're here to help.
Here's a very specific question from somebody who wants to know, in the Pfizer vaccine trials, their understanding is that 4 people got Bell's palsy. This person's had Bell's palsy twice. Mm-hmm. Is there a chance they could get it from the Moderna vaccine?
So Bell's palsy is something that can happen. It's usually a transient situation. It's kind of mimics a stroke a little bit. So that in case you don't know what Bell's palsy is, I've seen it. I've diagnosed it when it was like a facial kind of drooping, and you could sometimes see it in the person's mouth or in their speech a little bit, and it usually goes away. And it has, I think, been associated with viral infections. Now, my understanding with the Pfizer study is that the rate of Bell's palsy, when they looked at how many people were in the study and how often Bell's palsy happens anyway, without the COVID vaccine being given to them, that the rates were not any greater than when they got the vaccine. So I hope that makes sense. It was no greater numbers in the vaccine group for Bell's palsy than they would have expected to already be happening in a general population. But if you are concerned about the fact that you've had Bell's palsy twice, then maybe talk to your physician about what the circumstances were around those occurrences and what their opinion might be about you and getting immunization.
One more question before I want to go to variants, which is a very hot topic these days.
Yeah.
But one individual wants to know, I've had extreme vertigo 3 times and now suffer with dizziness on a daily basis. Is dizziness a side effect of the vaccine? Can the vaccine cause vertigo?
I have not seen dizziness listed anywhere in the side effects at all. So I would say no. Now, if you feel a little ill and achy afterwards, maybe you might feel more dizzy, but generally no. Vertigo is not a side effect of the vaccine.
Okay. How effective is the vaccine against variants?
That's a good question, and something that we are still looking carefully at. I mean, I say we, but it's not me. But I'm watching for sure the information that's coming out. My understanding, and I don't have all the numbers in my head. I think it's B1117 or something. But anyway, the strain that was discovered, I believe, in the UK. I've heard some good news about the effectiveness of the mRNA vaccines against that strain. But the one out of South Africa, and I know there's a few others, they just haven't seen enough folks exposed to those variants yet to have a really good picture of whether these vaccines are really, really effective against it. But the hope is that they are. They are not seeing a lot of shift in the spike protein in these variants, from my understanding. But I am not an expert in the variant world, so we're going to have to wait and see, and I'm sure that information is going to come out. You know, the really neat thing, Wayne, about mRNA vaccines is that it actually could be tweaked a little bit in a pretty easy way. So unfortunately, that might mean that we might have to get a booster if we knew we were going to get exposed to a certain variant. But we're going to have to wait and see what happens worldwide with these variants, and if we can get them settled down and kind of gotten rid of. But the really neat thing about mRNA technology is that it could actually be used very easily to be changed a little bit and make that mRNA recipe fit exactly what we need.
Okay. Another person who's tuning in has asked, what happens when and if the Yukon reaches this target of 75% vaccination? Can we stop wearing masks, Maria?
You better ask Dr. Hanley that, but I know that our goal would not be to continue masking forever. He is, and his team are looking, I'm sure, at what we call the epidemiology, and not just in Yukon, but in Canada. We have close neighbors and we share, you know, very active border with BC specifically, even though we broke up with her. We're hopefully going to get back together with her soon. And so we're going to be looking at case counts and what's being circulated. So 75% vaccination rate is going to play a role for sure, but we're also going to have to be looking at what's being passed around in Canada before we can make firm decisions, before Dr. Hanley can make firm decisions.
So how do we know the vaccine will work, and what's the point in taking it if I still have to wear a mask?
Well, I guess we have to actually trust what these studies are showing, and they are really clear. I was really excited to see how effective they were in the study. 94% is huge. Our flu vaccine, even though I trust it to do a good job at decreasing severity of influenza, it's only in the 60 to 70% range for healthy adults. So to have a 94% effectiveness is amazing. And to see that also, that effectiveness so high in the older population, where usually a 65 and older person, their immune system is just not quite as robust as it used to be. So we often see a vaccine not working quite as well for them. And it's really exciting to see how well this mRNA vaccine is working for them. So I'm confident in how it looks as far as its effectiveness in decreasing severity of illness and death from COVID. And I'm looking forward to the day that it's going to really be a great vaccine in our pockets to use to protect us.
I'm going to ask you to maybe address some of the youth who might be watching, who have nice, pink, healthy lungs and strong immune systems, maybe not like some of us older fellas. Question from a youth, I'm not going anywhere. I'm healthy. Why do I need it? Why bother?
So if you're 18 and over, you do qualify for a vaccine. So I'm going to assume that this person is 18 and over at this point, because we're not usually using it for very rare cases. I believe they're using it with really sick kids maybe, but it's not approved in Canada for younger than 18. So if you're healthy and you're 18 or over, yes, your risk of serious COVID infection is lower for sure, but we still do know that you could pass COVID to someone else. And so we really need to see all of us participate to protect all of us. We know that something called herd immunity works. So if we can have very little opportunity for any COVID infection that might sneak in to get passed from person to person, we're going to keep our case count to low or nothing. The other thing to point out too is sometimes a young healthy person can get very, very sick from COVID. We know that that does happen to a lesser extent than older people. And not only can it happen and be serious, you also could have long-term effects from COVID infection.
Thank you.
You know, there was another question that I heard about, and this person was saying that they had heard someone was thinking that maybe if they didn't get a vaccine, that maybe someone in a needier part of Canada where there's more COVID infection, or maybe another part of our world where has more challenges of even getting immunization, maybe those doses can be helpful to someone else instead, because we have such low case counts right now in Yukon. But actually, the decisions for getting vaccines for Yukon have already been made. Those vaccines are on the way. They're going to be here, and they're supplied for as many eligible adults as would take them. So our decision in Dawson, for instance, maybe to forego a vaccine so someone else can have it, really, unfortunately, won't make a difference globally. But if someone wants to reach out to Larry Bagnall, he can speak to that federally, because it's at the federal table that those decisions are made on how to help. And I'm really encouraged to how Canada has participated in COVAX and donated money toward that. But I think that globally, it's really important to also think about our neighbors. And so I'm hoping that Canada can continue to support that.
Some of the questions we received, I think, are harder to answer than others. One, of course, we had a brief chat earlier today about whether this was a microchipping campaign.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say to somebody, a two-part question, that might be concerned that this vaccine is being used to access biological information via a microchip campaign? What would you say to somebody like that?
That is not the case. I'm confident it's not. I freely took it myself, and I am not concerned at all about being a microchip campaign.
What would you say to somebody who, is on the receiving end of some of this information? We know that it's out there. There's a lot of scary stuff out there about this is engineered by the Chinese government to spread fear and control the world economy. This is about restricting freedoms. I don't expect you to have an answer to any of those questions, but what would you say to someone like that who might have those concerns or fears?
It has been a really scary year for many people, and we have a lot of anxiety around things. Things are not normal, and I get that for sure. It's been stressful for a lot of us. And so I think if we can kind of back away from some of the really scary stuff and say, well, wait a minute, what do I know is true? And can I go to some really reliable sources for information? A lot of people have a lot of ideas, but they're often not speaking out of a place of knowledge and expertise. So it's really important when we're making decisions about our health and about immunization to ask the people or go to the sources that study these things, and it's their life and what they have poured their whole life into, and the people that really know a lot about our immune systems and about how immunizations work. Because I think if we look at those sources and we can find a way to understand them, and that's what I'm hoping I can do today, is help people understand, bring all that crazy mumbo jumbo about lipid nanoparticles into like real life language and help you understand a little bit about what it's like. That might help a lot to allay some of those fears. But I would also say if you still have those concerns and you're really feeling that, it's probably good sometimes to get off social media, because that can feed our fear, and talk to somebody local who you really trust, a local healthcare provider. And I know the physicians here in Dawson are open to those conversations, and the nurses in the rural communities who work at the health centers, they would welcome your questions and be supportive of you. So if you continue to have a lot of anxiety around that and you really want some answers, then please ask.
Another question. I love the video on. Another question that has come through just now on the Slido, that's slido.com 84109, is what's the correlation between achieving herd immunity and new variants showing up?
What's the correlation between achieving herd immunity and new variants showing up? So herd immunity would be to COVID-19 generally. And we're going to have to look at how effective the immunization that we're using is to those variants. I'm not, is that what they're asking? I'm not entirely clear. If that person is...
I would speak maybe to herd immunity, because it's something we hear a lot about as well. And
yeah.
And maybe...
What does that mean?
What does that mean?
So I often think, when I think about herd immunity, I think about like the measles immunization, or let's even go to polio, something that most of us have received and that we hardly ever see in Canada. The only cases we get in Canada, I believe, are imported cases from other places. But we know in places like Afghanistan and Syria, where there's been war and the vaccine process has stopped or really slowed down, and people broadly, or kids, let's say, have not been immunized, that all of a sudden there's opportunity for these viruses to kind of gain a foothold. And so they have lost herd immunity because they have less people immune to this virus. And so it can get passed around. So here in Canada, if polio got imported and came here, a lot of us, probably almost all of us, have gotten a polio immunization, and we are immune to polio. So chances are very, very slim that that polio case will actually spread to anybody else because we have immunity to polio. But if that person who came into Canada with polio went to a community where only half of them had been immunized against polio, then chances would be much greater that that polio case could multiply and get passed around from person to person. So over many, many years of studying immunization, there have been numbers set and bars set about how high our immunization rates need to be. That's something I live. You know, I look at how many kids have been immunized in Dawson, for instance, against their childhood diseases, and we have a goal of a certain percentage. And so the 75% number that was set with the thinking that if we can achieve that, we hope that that will actually be a number that will really squash infection being passed around in Yukon territory.
Do we yet know if immunized folks will require boosters for COVID over time?
That's something that will again have to be looked at. You know, like I said earlier, Moderna is doing a 2-year follow-up with the people that were in their study. So we're going to have to look at how that plays out and how long immunity is lasting. As well, the variants and what happens with those is probably also going to inform our plan for the future on that, but that's not a question that we know right now. But certainly we need 2-dose series right now.
Great. Before we send it back to Thea, I got one more question. I learned a lot about you. The reason I thought you'd be the perfect person to conduct a session like this is just because, I mean, you're just such a nice person. Everybody here in Dawson knows you. Every time there's a question or concern related to health, you're the person we usually ring up and ask. As I was preparing for this, I was creeping your Facebook page and also found out that you're an Ohio Buckeyes fan.
It's true.
I did not know that. But also learned from Lane Gordon that you sell nice bagels at the farmers market. What is the secret to your bagels?
Yeah.
Well, you have to boil them before they get too flat and wrinkly.
That can stand boil them before they get too flat and wrinkly.
I don't know. That was my duds have, but my family still enjoys the duds, so I don't know.
Okay. Well, I really want to thank you, Maria, for taking the time to do this.
You bet.
I'm really happy that we had the opportunity to share your expertise with the rest of the Yukon as well. And I know that they probably found you to be a calm, rational voice, as we do know you to be here in Dawson. If anyone has any questions outside of these sessions, what should they do?
Well, broadly in Yukon, I would say the first place to start would probably be the COVID-19 info email address, and that can be found at yukon.ca. There's also lots and lots of information there that you could read about that. If that's hard for you to do, if you don't have access to a computer, I understand. The rural health centers are also a good resource. Your local family physician, if you live in a place where there's physicians that work there. And you can call the health center. I just want to be cautious that, you know, there's only 3 nurses working there right now, and our workload can be high. So we do want to answer your questions, though. If you have concerns, you need to get them answered, and I would encourage you to reach out to somebody.
Thank you very much, Maria. It's appreciated. Thea, I'll hand it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Wayne and Maria. That was such good information, and I really appreciate your calm demeanor and just being thorough on all of your questions. I want to invite individuals who didn't make it. We are recording this, so we will be posting it. And if you weren't able to watch on the live streams on Trondek's web Facebook page or on the City of Dawson Facebook page, we will be broadcasting this on One Yukon. And Maria has graciously agreed to do another evening session tonight. So continue to use the slido.com 84109, and we'll also be using the same login for Zoom. So look forward to seeing you at 5. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.